What is your gut, Ralph, about next Tuesday?
Nausea.
Oh, we got to keep that in.
Yeah.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. Hello, David.
Hello.
And our producer, Hannah Feldman. Hello, Hannah.
Hello, Steve.
And the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello, listeners. The last program before the November 5th election, we try to touch on important matters that others do not cover.
Yes, as we close in on Election Day, we're going to focus today's program on how organized labor and the Israeli lobby have influenced the election. First up is Mark Dimondstein, president of the American Postal Workers Union, who contends that, quote, Trump is once again spouting lies about the Postal Service in an attempt to dissuade people from voting by mail. This is voter suppression, plain and simple, unquote. 4 years ago, Public Citizen and the NAACP Defense Fund had to sue Postmaster General Louis DeJoy 9 times in order to ensure that the Postal Service could deliver everyone's mail-in votes. We'll talk to him about how threats to the Postal Service threaten our ability to vote and the relationship of the labor movement to the Trump and Harris campaigns. Next up, we'll welcome author, filmmaker, and journalist James Bamford. His latest piece in The Nation is entitled, Israel is Killing Whole Families in Gaza with Weapons Made in America. In his article, he traces the weapons used to wipe out a particular family in Gaza back to the weapons' origins, a tiny town in Iowa. We'll talk to him about that and whether Kamala Harris can rise above the Israel lobby in Washington and distance herself from Joe Biden's relentless support of an Israeli government that continues to rain terror down on a defenseless people. As always, somewhere in the middle, we'll check in with our irrepressible corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. But first, can the labor movement sign, seal, and deliver the election for either party? David?
Mark Dimondstein is the president of the American Postal Workers Union. Since 2013, when Mr. Dimondstein was elected, he has turned the APWU into a fighting activist organization. Mr. Dimondstein advocates for the rights of postal workers as well as the right of the American people to a vibrant public postal service. The American Postal Workers Union supports Medicare for all and belongs to the labor campaign for single payer. The APWU believes in paying a living wage and providing benefits to all workers. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Mark Dimondstein.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Yeah, good, Mark. Because it's just before the election, our listeners are obviously interested in the various players. So I want to ask you, the labor unions have traditionally supported the Democratic candidate throughout the decades. So you're an independent-minded labor union chief, and you'll see how much independence he has, listeners, when we have him discuss the Middle East. What is your view on the excessive obeisance of the labor union leadership, with a few exceptions, like you and the flight attendants group under Sarah Nelson?
I think you've touched on a really important point. It's really important for the union movement to have and to function in an independent way when it comes to politics and electoral politics. And I think it's been a weakness. I raised this with the AFL-CIO leadership and the council, so it's not a secret. I think it's a weakness for the labor movement to be following the baton, generally, of the Democratic Party leadership. And I think that it takes away, well, number one, an awful lot of labor union members represent all different political views. So we do have to respect that. But more important than that, you mentioned going back a couple generations, the Democrats more were viewed as the party of the working people and the Republicans, the party of the wealthier. But really, both of these parties generally represent the corporate interest and the Wall Street interest. Now, it doesn't mean that on particular issues, the Democrats may not be better than the Republicans. And maybe on some issue, some of the Republicans may be better than the Democrats. And that underscores the need for independent politics. So, for instance, in our union, we passed a resolution at our national convention, I believe I think it was 2016, calling for an independent approach to politics and saying, yes, in elections, we do want to elect pro-union, pro-worker candidates. But in addition, we want to focus on, for instance, issue-based politics, referenda on whether it's on the environment, on voting rights, on living wages. And then we're bringing workers together on the issues wherever we stand on the political spectrum. And so I think you're on it. I think that we've weakened ourselves as a labor movement, hitching our stars to one political party, and in many cases, almost asking permission or following the baton of the Democratic Party leadership. So we're for independent politics. Our union's on record to explore the possibilities of third parties, of a labor party, as we still work to elect good pro-union, pro-worker candidates to office from dog catcher to president.
Mark, the feedback I get over the months from people I know inside the AFL-CIO and others is that because a lot of the union's membership, about a third, may be Trump supporters, it tends to neutralize the policy positions in some respects by union leadership. And the AFL-CIO is very worried about a third of the workers who voted for Trump, for example, in 2020 or 2016. How do you handle that problem in your own union? Tell us how many members you have so people understand how big a union you had.
Ralph, we have about 200,000 members, and we definitely represent people throughout the entire political spectrum and throughout the whole country. So we represent people from right to left, left to right, everybody in between, and we represent people from the most rural outposts in the country to the urban centers. So first, the way we handle it is we don't try to tell people how they should think and how they should vote. We're all adults. We vote for what we think is in our best interest as workers, as family members, as community members, as citizens, and so on. So we don't try to dictate to our members how to vote, but we do have a responsibility to lead. And so leading may not always be popular. It may not always be easy. There's the old saying that, doing the right thing may not always be easy, but doing the right thing is always right. So I think leadership has a responsibility to educate our members, to activate our members, and to get our members to be involved in the political electoral process, whether it's referenda issues or whether it's through electing particular candidates attached to those issues, that we definitely need to educate what we think as leaders to our members, what's in the best interest of our members as postal workers, as workers, and of course, because we're so attached and dedicated to the public postal service, what's best for the people of the country on postal issues, but issues beyond that.
How do you communicate with your members? There used to be a labor press, as you know. They would have union newspapers and newsletters. How do you communicate with them now?
Yeah, and by the way, I think you may have been one of the people that educated me about the labor movement, maybe before the merger of the AFL and CIO, but in that period, had a number of radio stations that they gave up.
Right, Voice of Labor, it was called, National Radio Program.
So what we do is we have a bi-monthly magazine. We have a website that tens of thousands of people of our members come to every week. We do social media, certainly. We also have, because of our union contract, we have union bulletin boards throughout every workplace in the country, and we do bulletins for those. We also do live streams. I had a live stream with our legislative political director a couple of weeks ago talking about the importance of this election for postal workers and for workers in general, and the stark contrast of the candidates that are before us. And I think we had about maybe 1,700 people on that podcast. Thousands more listened to it after. We also took, some of the issues around the election in terms of voting rights. We took it to the streets on October 1st, advocating for vote by mail, acknowledging that, yes, there are some problems with the post office and mail, but there are extraordinary measures in place that the unions are working cooperatively, not only with each other. We have 4 postal unions, but with management to make sure those ballots get where they need to go on time. We had news coverage all over the country. I was on PBS NewsHour, national news, talking about that issue as well. So we use every vehicle we have, from print media to social media to television, and something called Ralph Nader Radio Hour as well. So here we are on the radio. The workers generally understand that both of these mainstream political parties have failed the working class. And so they are very open to something new, something different. And so, for instance, if you look at the Nebraska Senate race right now, you have an independent trade union leader running as an independent and running in part on the basis that both of these political parties leave the workers abandoned on their core issue. And whether he wins or not, point is that he's doing very well because the workers are responding to that message. Keep it based on the issues, but also the message that we need an independent path, working people in the political arena.
Let's talk about the Palestinian Holocaust and the genocide in Gaza. You early on, after October 7th, took a very strong stand based on your own personal history, which I think is an extraordinary, brave position because the labor unions were heavily under the influence of AIPAC and the Israeli government can do no wrong lobby in the U.S. They were induced to buy Israeli bonds instead of U.S. bonds with a lot of their money and sent to Israel on junkets. And you took a strong stand inside the AFL-CIO and with other labor union leaders in general, along with some allies that you had. Explain to the people why you took such a strong stand, Mark Dimondstein, and where you think it's going to go beyond the initial criticism of the Netanyahu regime by the labor unions.
Well, look, our union, the American Postal Workers Union, by its constitution and hopefully by its actions, we are a social justice union. We fight for justice in the workplace. That's our starting point. But we also realize that struggle for justice doesn't stop in the four walls of our post office. When we leave work, we're impacted by everything going on around us. And we live in communities, we live in a country, and we live on planet Earth. So we approach these larger issues. We don't shy away from dealing with political issues. There's some in the union and there's some outside the union that try to tell the unions, you should not be involved with politics. They're fine for Wall Street being involved with politics. They're fine for the billionaire class being involved in politics, but somehow workers in their union should not. We're the ones that should be. And so we look at what's going on first and foremost on October 7th and Netanyahu's reaction to that and Biden's reaction to Netanyahu. And right is right and wrong is wrong. And what's going on there is wrong. And it is a working class issue. People say, well, what does this have to do with us? Well, for one thing, workers different than Amazon, Bezos, and some of these other fat cats. Workers pay taxes and postal workers pay taxes. How those taxes are used is a deep issue to all of us. We don't want our taxes being used to fund, to arm the Netanyahu government dropping these 2,000-pound bombs that you referred to. So the other thing that makes it such a deep working class issue for people and workers here in the United States is we warned in early November about a wider war. This is going to lead likely to a wider war. Who's asked to fight these wars? It's working class people here and abroad who are asked to kill and be killed for who? For the interest of Wall Street, for the interest of fossil fuel companies, for the interest of sea lanes and transportation. And the third reason is we believe in solidarity. And our solidarity doesn't stop just in our country. We stand in solidarity with workers everywhere, and we stand in solidarity with the Palestinian unions and workers. So we very early, well, somewhat early anyway. Yes, we condemned the October 7th actions of Hamas. Yes, we condemned the response of the Netanyahu government targeting civilians, targeting infrastructure, targeting hospitals, targeting journalists, targeting universities, and purposely withholding food, energy, and medical care and so on, which is a war crime. By anybody's standard, it's a war crime. So we're a union that's not going to back war crimes. We're going to stand in solidarity with the people there. So we did speak up. I think we have an obligation to speak up. The Netanyahu government could not do what they're doing without the billions of dollars of military support from the United States government, and in this case, the Biden administration. And there are about 7 or 8 unions involved with a group called the National Labor Network for Ceasefire. There are other unions that have called for ceasefire that are not actively part of the group. So it's broader than those 7 or 8 unions. But more recently, we have upped the call to now stand for withholding military aid as a path, U.S. military aid, withhold U.S. military aid as the key step that's needed to force a ceasefire, get the massive humanitarian aid that's needed to the starving people of Gaza. An open air prison, basically concentration camp, where people have nowhere to go and are suffering like I don't know what else to call it but war crimes and genocide. And you did say I have a personal history. I do. I'm a proud Jewish American. Jewish Americans should be the first and say never again when it comes to genocide, when it comes to ethnic cleansing, and when it comes to war crime. And, we're not going to solve all the problems of the Middle East and the complicated history of the Middle East on this radio show. But let's at least be clear that the crimes committed against the Jewish people should never be allowed to be committed against anybody else, no matter who's doing it. And in this case, it's very important, I think, for Jewish Americans, and many have, such as through the Jewish Voices for Peace, spoken out loud and clear, not in our name.
Now, if the labor unions made their position known on members of Congress, because as you know better than almost anybody, the problem starts with the rubber stamp of Congress. So what kind of impact are you having on Congress now that you've taken a stand from the AFL-CIO, United Auto Workers, SEIU, your union, the flight attendants, quite significant unions?
Well, I'm not sure, Ralph, how much influence. We're obviously not having enough influence because the military funds are still flowing. There's clearly some resistance in Congress. Senator Bernie Sanders now is helping to lead the way, cutting military aid as part of the path to gain a ceasefire. So we certainly support that. But Congress is still letting the money flow and encouraging the money to flow that has the USA and our tax dollars on those bombs that are falling on innocent children, Gaza, and really other parts of Palestine. And as you point out now, Lebanon and other sovereign countries. That's a very dangerous moment when the Netanyahu government gets the support from the Biden government to indiscriminately bomb into sovereign countries. That's a recipe for a widening war and even a possible world war.
Mark, just looking at the upcoming election here, it's really astounding to see Kamala Harris send her two closest advisors to Wall Street about a month ago to get advice on her economic and tax policies, and not connecting with the Citizens for Tax Justice, which has a progressive proposal. She doesn't connect with citizen groups. She goes around campaigning with Liz Cheney, who, with her father and George W. Bush, were okay with the destruction of Iraq, a real criminal war of aggression that took over 1 million Iraqi lives and to this day has destroyed the Iraqi society. What's going on here? It's quite amazing that the most popular incumbent elected politician in America today is Bernie Sanders. And while he supports her, he has told her in September, you got to pick up 3 issues at least. You got to raise the minimum wage to a living wage, which is now at $7.25 frozen federally. You got to make sure that Social Security benefits are increased after being frozen for over 50 years. And you got to raise taxes on the wealthy and the big corporations, which are undertaxed. And there's overwhelming support for this. 25 million workers will get a raise between $7.25 and $15 an hour, for example. 65 million elderly will get a larger Social Security check paid for by increasing the income level of the rich to the Social Security tax. 200 Democrats supported that in 2022, led by Congressman John Larson. And listen to this, 85% of the American people support increasing taxes on the super rich and the big corporations. What more does she want? And she's ignoring Bernie Sanders and going into one state after another with people like Liz Cheney. Can you explain?
Well, look, as we talked about earlier, Ralph, both of these mainstream parties generally represent the corporate class and Wall Street. There are some differences on certain issues, but generally, if we look at the broad issues, the taxes, the issues of war and peace, the issues of the environment, things that are near and dear to the hearts of all working people. Both of them, as I said earlier, have failed us. Now, I will say this. Our union is firmly supporting the Harris-Walz ticket based on the issues, based on their approach to the post office and the support for need for a strong public postal service, based on some more support for unions. Trump, for example, is on written record to sell off, privatize, break up, and sell off the public postal service to private corporations. The Democrats are on record supporting a public postal service. But I say to a lot of people, Ralph, whatever happens next Tuesday, and in this particular part, I'm with Liz Cheney a little bit, although I agree with you about her family history and her history in relation to these unjust wars. But I think she's doing a very important thing, speaking up some truth to power on the question of the danger of rising fascism and the Trump-led rising fascist movement that we're facing in this country. So on that issue, I'm willing to and have united with her as well. But what I tell people, whatever happens next Tuesday, our work isn't done. The divisions that have been created by white supremacy, by this anti-immigrant fever out here, these things aren't going away. Issues that divide workers instead of unite workers, the bigotry, the growing bigotry, the attack on women's rights to reproductive freedom and health, the attacks on voting rights. These are issues that are going to be here with whoever wins the election. So the working people and the trade union movement are going to have a lot of work to do, whatever the outcome, to unite the working class, to fight for those kind of things you're raising. Living wage, strong retirement benefits, and a stronger social security system. An environment where we can not just have this generation live our lives, but the coming generations live their lives. So we're going to have a heck of a lot of work to do. But I think your examples of how Kamala Harris is campaigning is an indication that we have to be independent of these parties and we have to keep fighting. We had a president years ago, name was Mo Biller, always said the struggle continues. And he's right. And it's going to continue to whatever happens Tuesday. And what I don't want to see is us working together and successfully keeping Trump from the White House again, which I think is a noble and needed goal. Then somehow take a deep breath and say, good, our work is done. It's not done. It's going to continue, and we're going to have to be very firm and determined in that.
A very important caveat, listeners. What's so frustrating to so many people in the progressive area in this country is that Democrats should be landsliding this worst, most corrupt, ugly, lying, provocatory, ignorant Republican Party in history. I mean, the leading Republicans in the past, Teddy Roosevelt, Senator Robert Taft, Dwight Eisenhower, they couldn't believe what this Republican Party's been turned into. They don't believe in preparedness for coming pandemics. They think climate violence is a hoax, even though you have tornadoes, drought, wildfires, hurricanes at record levels in this country, leveling whole communities. And here the Democratic Party is in a squeaker race. The polls are too close to call with the Trump forces. And that's what is so frustrating. It's not just that Trump has to be defeated. The question is why the Democrats are not landsliding these Republicans at the congressional, state, legislative, and gubernatorial level. That's another question, of course. Steve?
4 years ago, Mark, Public Citizen and the NAACP Defense Fund had to sue the Postmaster General, I believe, 9 times to ensure mail-in voting could happen during a pandemic. What 4 years later is the landscape today in terms of mail-in voting, the resistance to it, the efficacy of it?
So, Stephen, in 2020, there was a huge concern when the new PMG came in that the service was poor. There wasn't enough emphasis on making sure that the ballots would move. And that led to some of the lawsuits. Our union was deeply involved, organizing the people of the country, pushed back. And I think because of that pushback, by the time we got to the election, we all rose to the occasion. In 2020, turned out to be a smashing success in terms of vote by mail. Something like 99.9% of the ballots made it in time, or at least within 7 days and in time to be counted. And what happened because of that pushback, and call it a popular uprising, we actually established a lot of extraordinary measures that postal management did. But it was with the support of the unions and the activity of the union. So the postal workers are extremely dedicated to the civic duty of giving people access to the ballot box. And here we were in a pandemic. And so when I talk about 99.9%, you're talking about 65 million votes. This 65 million plus votes were done through election mail in 2020. So that same spirit seems to have carried forward in 2022. It was very successful then. We have a national level task force with management and the unions that meet on this. We have task forces at the local level to make sure those ballots get through the system, not on who we think voted for who, but on the defense of the public's right to have access to their cherished and hard-fought right to vote. So right now, it's sort of the same thing. Yes, there's problems with the mail. We all feel it. But yes, people should have confidence in vote by mail because there's a lot of extraordinary measures. Would we like those extraordinary measures to be there every day of the year for all our mail? Yes, we would. But we're glad it's there for the process of election mail. The population loves voting by mail. I tell people I'm one of the fortunate ones because where I live, they have automatic vote by mail. I don't have to vote by mail, but I get it to the house. My wife and I vote at the kitchen table. It's great. You can have a discussion. You can think about it. You can vote on your time. You don't have to wait 3 hours in a line or 4 hours in a line or not be able to vote at all because you got to go punch a clock and earn a living and you can't get off from work to be able to spend that kind of time at a polling booth. So we're very confident that vote by mail is secure. Those who are against it, Steve, are basically, this is also Trump-led. This was part of the big lie of 2020, part of what led to this despicable January 6th coup attempt. Is it somehow the election was stolen and rigged? Why? In large part because of vote by mail. All the facts say something else. Sure, it works. It increases voter participation in the electoral process, which we should all be for. So the resistance to vote by mail right now is from those who want to suppress working people and oppress people from voting and having their voices.
Hannah?
You mentioned the statements that you put out in solidarity on issues on the ceasefire. It seems like if you wanted to mobilize an action in solidarity, say a general strike or something comparable, it could have an immense impact if your members were to participate. Are there any actions you're considering, something like a general strike?
Look, that's kind of a historical question as well. At certain moments in history, when the working class is organized and ready to, at a certain point, and enough is enough, then those kind of things have and certainly could happen again. And the more power we display as workers united, the more the gains will be. So certainly coordination amongst unions. Sean Fain, I think was mentioned earlier in the show, the terrific new president of the United Auto Workers. He's made a call in that direction, asking unions to consider common expiration date of May Day 2028 contract negotiations, try to build that kind of solidarity and that kind of unity and that kind of situation where it could lead to more concerted action in the streets. By process, we may, who knows, Hannah, but I don't think it's around the corner, but I also think that things can change rapidly at times, depending on what happens in the political and the economic world. I think people have showed with some of this rising militancy in the working class of the U.S. that they've had enough. They're ready for more fundamental change. But, our union is hampered by a law that says we don't have the legal right to strike. So it's another hurdle for us. We did in 1970. It was victorious. But you have to have certain things that come together, leverage, power, moments, willingness of people to take risks. So we'll have to see where it goes. But short of those kind of actions, the more solidarity we have with each other as working people, as unions, the more solidarity we have with, the justice fights within our communities, the more solidarity we have worldwide that we talked about earlier, working to save innocent lives in Palestine and so on. Those things all help build our power.
Before we conclude, Mark Dimondstein, tell people who want to get more information about the Postal Service and your union. You have a website?
It's apwu.org. We also have on the website a campaign for a better post office, which is trying to rally the people of the country to demand the kind of service that they deserve. That's also on our website. We have a lot of information on voting rights and vote by mail on the website. Always welcome people to come on and always welcome your input and thoughts. Look, we look at part of our effort in the union, and we're in negotiations right now with postal management, but some of what when we're certainly negotiating for improving workers' wages, rights, and benefits, but we're also negotiating for a better service for the people of the country. So we're at the bargaining table with postal management, making demands that they expand service, making demands that they improve service, making demands that they staff up so that the people of the country get the service that they need and deserve and have in writing under the law, but not always in life. So we're proud to stand with the people of the country. And I know, Ralph, you and your organization has been on the forefront of promoting and defending and promoting the public good and the public commons. And we're very proud to be really an essential part and a key part of those public commons.
Well, thank you very much, Mark Dimondstein. Just give the website slowly once more in case any of our listeners didn't get it.
apwu.org.
Thank you very much, Mark.
Thank you, Ralph.
We've been speaking with Mark Dimondstein. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. When we come back, we turn our attention once again to the state terrorism being unleashed by Israel in an ever-widening conflict. But first, let's check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, November 1, 2024. I'm Russell Mokhiber. A new interactive map released last week by Food and Water Watch paints a comprehensive picture of factory farm domination in the United States. The resource, based on the latest USDA Census of Agriculture, includes new density rankings that reveal the extreme concentration of factory farms and their waste in communities across the country, endangering clean water and public health. Food and Water Watch's analysis reveals the top two states with the most factory farm waste: Iowa with 109 billion pounds annually, that's 25 times the state's human waste, and Texas with 102 billion pounds annually, with 2.5 times the state's human waste. Rounding out the top 10 factory farm waste states: California, Nebraska, Kansas, Minnesota, North Carolina, Colorado, Idaho, and Wisconsin. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman, Hannah, and Ralph. Has Kamala Harris done enough to distance herself from Joe Biden's Middle East policies to persuade voters who care about the genocide in Gaza? David?
James Bamford is a best-selling author, Emmy-nominated filmmaker for PBS, award-winning investigative producer for ABC News, and winner of the National Magazine Award for reporting for his writing in Rolling Stone on the war in Iraq. He is a frequent contributor to The Nation magazine, and he is the author of several books, including Spy Fail, Foreign Spies, Moles, Saboteurs, and the Collapse of America's Counterintelligence. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, James Bamford.
Well, thank you, David. Glad to be here. Appreciate it.
Welcome, James. I want to direct attention to your article in The Nation on October 21st, 2024, where you get very specific about the weapons that Biden, Harris, and the Congress are supplying Netanyahu's regime to produce the genocide in the Palestinian Holocaust that gets worse every day. The New York Times had maps of Gaza and information about how 60% of one city has been destroyed, 80% of another city in Gaza has been destroyed. It's probably the largest amount of bombing in terms of tons of explosives per person. There are 2.3 million people in Gaza in world history. And you go back to the factories and certain communities by name in the United States that are building these. Can you go into that so we can start right by the factories, the big companies, and the workers who are producing these weapons of mass destruction shipped every day to the Netanyahu regime?
Right. Yeah. The reason I wrote that was because people read about the bombs blowing up schools and refugee camps and hospitals and killing scores and scores, hundreds, thousands of people, 42,000 at this point. But few people realize that it's middle America largely that's building the bombs, sending the bombs. The American taxpayers are paying for the bombs. All the Israelis are doing is dropping the bombs. So, for example, the one case that I was able to trace back was when this family, there was a very young girl, 6 years old. Her name was Hind. And she and her family were fleeing some of the bombing. But instead of allowing their car to flee to safety, it was stopped by an Israeli tank who opened fire at the car, killing virtually everybody in there. And a lot of this was captured on audio because the family called for an ambulance. And because of the Israeli policies, it took 3 hours for the Israelis to give them approval to send the ambulance to the car where these people were located. And as the car got almost to the car, as the ambulance got almost to the car, the tank opened fire with not with a machine gun, but with the entire cannon on the tank and blew up the ambulance with the two paramedics in it. So it killed the family in the car, killed the paramedics, and then a tractor rode over the bulldozer rode over the car, apparently as a final sign to make sure everybody was dead. I mean, it was unbelievably horrible. So looking back, the tractor that actually rode over the car was made by Caterpillar, an American company in the Midwest, who sends enormous amounts of tractors and so forth to the Israeli government. The shell that was fired at the ambulance was built by a thing called the Iowa Ammunition Plant, which is in a small town called Middletown, Iowa, about 350 people. So it's the biggest employer in the whole area. And it's an enormous plant, and that's all they do is make bombs and make missiles and make weapons. So those are all made in these small little towns or shipped off to Israel. The 2,000-pound bombs, for example, the U.S. shipped 14,000 of them, I think, between October and December, 14,000 2,000-pound bombs. And they were used to drop on refugee camps, hospitals, killing scores and hundreds and thousands of innocent people. And those 2,000-pound bombs are only made in one place. It's made in McAllister, Oklahoma, at the McAllister Ammunition Plant, McAllister Army Ammunition Plant, another small town, middle America, which actually creates these bombs that are sent to Israel. So the tank that shot at the car, killing the family, it got critical parts that were made from the U.S. and sent to Israel. The shell that was used to blow up the ambulance was made in the U.S., and the tractor that rode over the car was made in the U.S. So all this stuff is made in the U.S. by Americans and paid for by American taxpayers. And the Israelis just take it and drop the bombs and run over cars and use tanks to kill innocent people without many people realizing that it's us that are behind all that.
Well, this devastation in a very small area, geographically the size of the city of Philadelphia, was 2.3 million, has been under constant bombing every day since October 7th. The bombing has, as you point out in your article, has been heavily on civilian infrastructure. What else is there? Healthcare facilities, hospitals, refugee camps, schools, mosques, churches, transportation systems, water mains, electricity grids, and apartment buildings, homes. Nothing was spared. It was also subjected to the genocidal requirements of the Israeli military, which is, in the words of the Israeli minister, no food, no water, no medicine, no electricity, no fuel. And of course, that spells death and destruction right there. The chair of the Global Health Department of the University of Edinburgh last December said, if the conditions of bombing and collateral death and injury continue, 500,000 people in 2024 will die. Letters to Lancet, the medical journal, a few months ago had it most conservative estimate 186,000 dead. There are others who think the real figure is near 400,000. In that context, why in the world would James Bamford, the truth teller of all, the fact digger of all journalists, twice in his article use the phrase over 41,000 dead? 1/10 probably of the real figure.
Right. And I talk about how under all that rubble, under all those apartment buildings, are disintegrating bodies. I mean, they're bodies that are not being counted. And then every day there are people that are starving to death because of the amount of lack of food that's getting in there and the conditions, the weather conditions that are turning bad. So yeah, the 41,000, 42,000 is just a number that's out there. It certainly is far less than the accurate number of people that have been killed so far.
Even the progressive magazines, even groups like Democracy Now! Keep using these Hamas figures, and it makes a tremendous difference whether you get a more reasonable estimate of the death count and the dying and the disease and the serious injuries in this totally obliterated area, it gives a different dynamic to the diplomatic, political, and civic intensity to end that conflict and to get the humanitarian aid big time for the survivors of the Gaza Holocaust. So it's not a minor problem. I don't know any time in history where there has been such an undercount supported and repeated by all parties on all sides to this genocide supported by the U.S. government. Please enlighten us as to why this is the case.
Well, I think one of the reasons, as I write in my article, that the Israeli government deliberately keeps journalists out of Gaza. One of the reasons is because of, as I reported in the article, the only way you're able to draw a connection between the bombing and the huge amounts of deaths are if you actually find a piece of one of these bombs or a piece of one of these shells that has a serial number on there. Once you have that, then you could trace it back to the actual plant. So that's one of the reasons why the Israelis don't want journalists running around in Gaza, because they'll find how much involvement the U.S. actually has. The other reason, as you say, is that they're going to find all these evidence of far more bodies in the rubble than the count establishes. I mean, if all they're doing is moving people from one area, they bomb that area and leave huge amounts of death and destruction, and then move them to another place. There's nobody there to count the people who are dead. So that's one of the problems. I mean, it's an impossible number. And if you're a journalist and you have to write an article and you deal with fact checkers and so forth, I mean, you can't make up a number. That's the problem. You've got to use an established number in order to have a valid fact in there. Like you, I keep saying that there's far more bodies out there than the count suggests.
Well, in your article, you cite a Euromed human rights watch, a monitor that counted 2,750 Palestinian families who had lost at least 3 members to Israeli attacks over the previous 11 months. They found 365 Gazan families who've lost more than 10 members in the ongoing war. These give you clues. There have been UN humanitarian agencies who, 10 months ago said starvation is going to kill hundreds of thousands in the year 2024. Well, these deaths don't wait until December 31st. They're happening day by day at an accelerated level. So having said this, you know a lot about the CIA and the NSA. You wrote the great first book exposing the National Security Agency. They are studying all the time potential blowback to U.S. empire, attacks, wars, special forces, blowing up places over the years, Iraq and Libya and Afghanistan and Yemen and Somalia, and now it's occurring in the West Bank, it's occurring in Lebanon, it's occurring in Syria. The U.S. is up to its neck in co-belligerency and co-combativeness with the Israeli machine. And we have, aircraft carriers, destroyers, Marines off the eastern Mediterranean, fighter planes, surveillance. We have great surveillance over Gaza, and satellite pictures are given to Joe Biden with his intelligence briefing, which he receives regularly in the White House. So what is the danger of a counterattack? What they would call another 9/11, the inexpensive ability now to build armed drones and garages, or any other attack by the survivors of the innocent civilians who had nothing to do with October 7th and have lost dozens of their extended family, or by other solo actors. You believe there's a danger here? And if it does occur, it will turn the country of the USA into a complete turmoil where all other civilian life and death priorities are shoved aside as we've become an even more armed fortress, suppressing civil liberties and turning the country into an empire out of control.
Well, as a matter of fact, last August for The Nation, I wrote an article about that, the intelligence assistance that U.S. gives to Israel on the genocide. Basically, it was titled Israel's Assassination Program and its Ties to U.S. Intelligence. And in that article, I cited a number of documents that have been released by Edward Snowden. And what it showed was that in an earlier war between the United States and Hezbollah, the NSA had liaison officers within Unit 8200. That's the Israeli version of NSA. And Unit 8200 has liaison officers at Fort Meade at NSA headquarters. So it's the closest cooperation between any other country, any other ally between the United States and Israel. So what these documents showed was that the Israelis were asking for specific information on targeted assassination against the Hezbollah, for example. And the liaison officer was pushing back, saying, under US law, we can't give you the exact longitude, latitude, the coordinates for these people. And then there was discussion between NSA and GCH, or the Unit 8200, and they did come to an agreement where apparently the information was given to them. So in this case, the current genocide, there is no question in my mind that the U.S. is assisting in every single aspect of intelligence, which is supplying overhead imagery, supplying signals intelligence, NSA information to carry out the assassinations that they did in Lebanon and in Iran, for example, and so forth. So all that is U.S. help. I mean, if the U.S. is supplying the bombs, the 2,000-pound bombs that they drop on innocent civilians in the refugee camps, there's no question that they're going to give targeted information to the Israelis from NSA. Now, in regard to the other part of your question, which was, will all this help lead to retroactive terrorist action against the United States? Well, I would suspect it would. I wrote a book called A Pretext for War about how we got into the war in Iraq, where I described a great deal of detail on what led up to the war in Iraq, and how after 9/11, how the actually what happened was that the U.S. had this embargo basically on Iraq, and even before 9/11, there was a great deal of attention paid by many of the people who were eventually behind the 9/11 attack to what was going on between the U.S. and Israel and attacks on Lebanon. It was actually attacks on Hezbollah in Lebanon that created the anger that directed the terrorists who eventually attacked on 9/11. So if that was the anger that caused the attacks on 9/11, you can imagine what conducting a genocide as well as conducting all these assassinations and bombings in Lebanon and so forth will have on creating a new generation of terrorists to attack the United States. So it's this round robin. We keep generating the anger, generating the hatred by aiding Israel in doing this, and then we end up back where we started with more terrorist action. So yes, I could see this happening all over again, terrorist actions against the United States as a result of the genocide.
Let me ask you a question some people are wondering about. When Israel occupied southern Lebanon for 18 years after invaded Lebanon in 1982, which led to the creation of Hezbollah because the Shiite population in southern Lebanon, which had very little to do with the Palestine Liberation Organization, was being beat up on by the Israeli army, and no one was defending them. So arose Hezbollah out of the Shiite population. People often don't know that or forget that. But you've done research on international war crimes. Of all the war crimes, the different categories, the Geneva Convention, do you know any war crime he and his coalition, extremist coalition, has not committed?
Well, if there is one, he's probably going to commit it in the next week or two. I wouldn't put it past him. He's probably got a list he's checking off to make sure, because there's no pushback, not only from the United States, but basically Western Europe. You know, once you get to genocide, all the other war crimes are secondary. So once you're committing a genocide, that's the mother of all war crimes. So he hasn't had any problem doing that. And another article I wrote for The Nation, I wrote how this whole idea is to take over Gaza and commit the genocide to kill all the either kill all the Palestinians, which is what they're doing, or force them out of the country into Jordan or whatever, in order to take over Gaza, to annex Gaza, which has always been in the back of their mind. And now is the West Bank also is what they're, I think, looking at to maybe to annex. You know, the right-wing lunatics that are working with Netanyahu, that's one of their goals, is to eliminate the Palestinians from the occupied territories, whether Gaza or the West Bank, and take it over to annex it for the settlers. I mean, the settlers have been working on that for years, killing scores and hundreds of Palestinians who are trying to live their life in that squalid area.
The greater Israel has been a goal since the founding of Israel and
Right.
even before. They want the whole Palestine. They would like southern Lebanon up to the Litani River, which has extremely valuable water that the Israelis want. We'll go to Steve now.
Yes, James, back in early August, you wrote an article for The Nation that says how Kamala Harris can show she's not like Biden on Israel. And you sort of pinned that to her choice of vice president. This is before she chose Tim Walz. Has Kamala Harris shown she's not like Biden? And has Tim Walz had any effect on that?
Well, no and no. I mean, it's actually been the opposite. She has a Democratic convention where she's nominated for president, and she doesn't even allow the speaker on the platform to say anything about the Palestinians. I mean, we're committing a genocide there, and yet nobody's allowed to say a word about it on the platform. And that's been Kamala Harris's policy all along. And never say a word about the U.S. involvement in genocide. As I wrote in my last article, the U.S. is playing an enormous role. We're building the bombs, we're sending the bombs, and we're paying for the bombs.
David?
Over the summer, Abu Dhabi said they would be willing to commit peacekeeping troops in Gaza. What is the viability of the United States, the United Nations, and Saudi Arabia and Jordan saying we're sending in peacekeepers, Israel get out? Can that happen? Is that just Netanyahu won't allow that because he wants all of Gaza, right?
Well, I don't think it will happen because they're not going to go in there unless there's some kind of an agreement with Israel. Otherwise, they're just going to be blown up like everybody else. They'd be violating territory. I mean, I would love to see a foreign force go in there to fight back against the Israelis, but I don't think it's going to happen. And I don't think Saudi Arabia is that serious about stopping this in the first place. They're just waiting for the opportunity to make a deal with Israel to get technology and everything else.
But isn't that the only answer, to send in troops and order the Israelis out?
But who's going to do that? Americans certainly aren't going to go in there and do that. Jordan hasn't suggested that, they're on their border. They're not suggesting that they go in there and do it. I just don't see. I think the only way is international pressure. I wrote about this in my last book, that the only thing that you can ever do to Israel to affect Israel is to have an international boycott, sanctions. You have to treat it like the worst country on earth. That's what happened with South Africa. That's what stopped apartheid. Once they couldn't buy anything. I mean, look what we send all these embargoes and sanctions to Russia, but we do nothing to sanction Israel. We should be sending sanctions instead of bombs to Israel. So I think, to me, the only thing that will work is if the world, pretty much Europe, the United States, and the rest of the world collectively get together and say Israel is a decrepit state that should not get any money or any aid from anybody, and it should be frozen from any kind of trade.
Yeah.
My question is about the Anti-Defamation League. What have they been up to? What has their role been at least since October 7th?
Well, I wrote a long article about the ADL, and it showed the connections to Israel and how for years the ADL has been basically just the Israeli voice for the far right in the United States. They're the cheerleaders for the genocide going on right now.
Yeah, what's interesting is that whether it's AIPAC or the Anti-Defamation League or any other allied groups, they draw no lines for Netanyahu, saying, we've been supporting you for years, but you've gone too far, and you better stop. They're completely supportive of whatever Netanyahu does, period.
Yeah, and in this article that I wrote, and also in a piece I did for ABC News when I was the investigative producer for Peter Jennings, we looked into the ADL, and back in the late 90s, ADL had this very close relationship, actually going back into the early 90s with South Africa. And they were having secret meetings with members of the San Francisco Police Department, getting secret documents on the Palestinians having meetings in California, and then passing that on not only to Israel, but passing it on to the South African government. And the district attorney in San Francisco actually brought charges against the ADL over that. So the ADL has had this really corrupt history in the past, and I don't think anybody should think that there's any line between the Israeli far right and the ADL. I think they're basically the same thing.
Well, we're out of time. We've been speaking with James Bamford, documentarian and reporter extraordinaire over the years, and continuing to show a contrast between his reporting and the mainstream press on many issues relating to the U.S. empire abroad and the deterioration of freedom and democracy in the United States. Thank you very much, James.
Well, thank you, Ralph.
I want to thank our guests again, Mark Dimondstein and James Bamford. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call The Wrap-Up, featuring Francesco DeSantis with In Case You Haven't Heard. A transcript of this program will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour Substack site soon after the episode is posted.
Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel. And for Ralph's weekly column, it's free. Go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com. To order your copy of the Capitol Hill Citizen, Democracy Dies in Broad Daylight, go to capitolhillcitizen.com.
And remember to continue the conversation after each program. Go to the comments section at ralphnaderradiohour.com and post a comment or question on this week's episode.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt, Hannah Feldman, and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody, for our latest report for people who don't have much time to read newspapers. It's titled, Recognizing Time-Pressured Headline Writers' Contribution to Readers. It's quite a unique, never-before-produced type of report, and very informative for people who want to leaf through pages of headlines who basically convey the substance of the article. You can obtain a copy by going to csrl.org. csrl.org. Thank you.
That the system pulls you down. Stand up, stand up. Oh, you should step up. I think that you